Ms. Cheadle, you said that the buck stops with me, and I agree. I don't think you should resign. I think you should have been fired. Ma'am, you are a DEI horror story. I've told my daughter multiple times, my wife and my daughter, we talk to her all the time about how she's going to succeed in life. She'll succeed in life by achieving. Ma'am, you have not achieved today. You've let the American public down. If it was up to me, you'd be gone.
Let me just pick up where my colleague from Tennessee left off. Director Cheadle, was the incident on July 13th due to DEI, or rather systemic failures in communication and potentially safety protocols?
The incident on the 13th has nothing to do with DEI. The incident on the 13th has to do with a failure or a gap either in planning or communication.
Thank you so much. In fact, I have a few articles that I will enter into the record once I wrap up that actually acknowledge a number of women specifically for their valor in their service, whether it's been in various levels of law enforcement. I want to stick here for just a second, because earlier you had a conversation in which there was a discussion about training. And I want to talk about training, and I want to talk about the fact that there's been a little bit of dancing around as it relates to this being a suspicious person and this being a situation that was perceived to be a threat. And it seems as if there's a different analysis that takes place. One of my questions has to do with if you have any bias training that your officers undergo. And the reason that I ask that, because as a civil rights lawyer, I have learned so many times in having to deal with law enforcement that there usually is not a perception of a threat when it is a young white male, even if they are carrying a long gun. Yet a lot of times, at least in this country, when it comes to law enforcement, there is a perceived threat just by somebody having a little bit more melanin in their skin. So I'm curious to know, because a lot of times, one of the things that we have consistently pushed for on my side of things, and when I say my side, is once we are looking at a tragedy in which law enforcement made an error, is the bias training and whether or not our officers are getting it. So I'm curious to know, in some of the training that you talk about that is part of your budget, has bias training been part of that?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you. I know that today is a rough day, and on that day in Pennsylvania, it was a rough day. And the reality is that I understand it, and you may or may not know the answer to this question.
Okay, let's get started, because Representative Jasmine Crockett is not holding back as she takes aim at some of the most important issues that are currently endangering public confidence. Crockett is drawing attention to the hazardous gaps in gun control laws that politicians like to overlook, as well as the absence of true accountability in law enforcement. She is establishing the link between unbridled prejudice, an increase in political violence, and the proliferation of conspiracy theories, all of which are seriously undermining public safety. In addition, Crockett calls names when pointing out leadership shortcomings, attacking Ms. Cato for making such a huge mistake that Crockett outright suggests she be fired. Personal animosity isn't the issue. When failure jeopardizes lives, it's about demanding results. More significantly, Crockett is exposing racial inequities in law enforcement training by highlighting the profoundly distorted perceptions of threat, particularly in relation to young white males. She is lobbying for funding for bias training, because, in the absence of it, the system continues to reinforce the very inequalities it is meant to correct. Crockett is pushing the topic into the public eye rather than merely advocating for change.
In the space in which this event took place, it was an open carry space. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. So I hail from the state of Texas, and interestingly enough, I was serving in the state house right after there was a mass shooting in El Paso. We had an opportunity to do right by our citizens in Texas, but we did not. Instead, they passed permitless carry. And what my colleagues kept trying to get you to answer, because we want to come up with solutions, we don't want to keep pointing the finger. And right now, you've got a bunch of fingers that are pointed at you. But our job is to solve problems for the American people. And to be perfectly honest, the numbers are clear. I think almost every major law enforcement agency come forward and say that they were against permitless carry because they said that their jobs would be made more difficult. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the state of Texas decided that they would ignore those warnings, and they passed the law instead. And right after they passed that law, we ended up with Uvalde. And we heard the stories of those officers that were scared to go in and save those babies because of the firearm in which that, in that case, 18-year-old had in his hands. They also were given an opportunity to say, hey, raise the age and make it to where at least you have to be 21 before you can possess this type of weapon. And they chose not to. And we have the facts. It shows, and I'll enter this into the record as well if there is no objection, deaths from firearms keep climbing in Texas decades after lawmakers began weakening gun regulations. That is from the...
Let's be honest. It is not merely political posturing when a Texas lawmaker takes a stand against the state's careless, permitless gun policies. The alarm is desperate and has been going off for far too long. They're pointing directly at the unpleasant reality. Even law enforcement has issued warnings about these lax rules. However, Texas politicians ignored it because they were so enamored with performative freedom politics. And the price? A rise in gun-related fatalities, broken communities, and horrific events like the blood you pledged to shed that could have been avoided with even the most basic common sense changes. This has nothing to do with taking away rights. The goal is to save lives. However, the Texas lawmakers doubled down on playing games with public safety rather than paying attention to the victims, police officers, and bereaved families who are the ones who truly experience the violence. Whole towns are now suffering as a result.
Ordered.
Thank you so much. The last thing that I'm just going to make a point of saying is that we all care about this issue because we know that there has been a spike in violence, political violence in this country. Are you aware of the fact that the numbers are higher right now?
Yes.
Okay. In addition to that, and I'm going to point a little blame at ourselves because right now you got all the fingers pointed at you. But the reality is that we have a number of congressional members that are consistently engaging in violent rhetoric, and it needs to be toned down. The reality is that people are listening and they're paying attention. But unfortunately, another thing that is happening because we're not getting answers from you today is the conspiracy theories. They have already began. Have you heard of any of the conspiracies?
Yes.
Okay. The problem with these conspiracies is that when people believe that, say, the president of the United States ordered a hit, or they believe it was an inside job, or whatever conspiracies they believe because they don't have any facts in front of them, that potentially incites the next level of violence at the next event in retaliation for this. So we are only begging for your job as it relates to being the director, as well as the men and women that you are protecting as their director, that you keep them safe by making sure that the American people have the information that they need so that they can feel as if Secret Service is on the side of the American people. And ma'am, I don't doubt that Secret Service is on the side of the American people. But right now, so long as these conspiracy theories continue to fester, it is going to make your job that much harder. Thank you so much.
Let's break through the clamor. There is an increase in political violence. The irresponsible and provocative speech of members of Congress who would rather make cheap political points than defend the nation they pledged to serve is largely to blame. Mean tweets aren't the only issue here. It's about creating an atmosphere that encourages conspiracy theories to spread and leads to violent acts based solely on fiction. Tragedies occur when lies are used as a weapon. The worst part is still to come. Politicians are not the only organizations that need to be protected, such as the Secret Service. The goal is to protect the public's trust. The entire system is at risk of collapsing if the public begins to think that even our security services are tainted by conspiracies. Ultimately, the violence we are witnessing now will only be the beginning if we fail to hold irresponsible leaders accountable and protect the integrity of our democratic institutions. What do you think then? If you liked this video, please let us know in the comments. Remember to click the subscribe button. The following one is considerably more contentious.